Good afternoon, and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. My name is Stefan Freeland, the coordinator of the series, and today is my pleasure to welcome Jenny Broadhurst from the Salish Sea Institute to introduce today's guest. Thank you, Jenny. Welcome.
Thanks, Stefan, and welcome to everybody. I'm Jenny Broadhurst, director of the Salish Sea Institute. The Salish Sea Institute was started at Western Washington University to create a stronger connection between the university and the place where we live, at the edge of the Salish Sea, on the ancestral homelands of the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe. The Salish Sea Institute shares science and connects people in order to better protect the Salish Sea. By connecting people to this place and teaching more about it, from history to present day environmental challenges, we foster stronger stewardship and protection for this amazing place we call the Salish Sea. We recently created a multidisciplinary Salish Sea Studies minor here at Western, the first ever in the world. Students who are interested in learning more about the minor can check out our Salish Sea Institute website and feel free to follow up with Dr. Natalie Beloy or me. Salish Sea Studies classes fill up fast and it's registration time, so get on that. When I started in 2017, the creation of a State of the Salish Sea report was on my top 3 priority list. And thanks to a generous private donation, we were able to take it on. It's critically important for all of us to erase the border as we think about the Salish Sea and to understand how it functions and what's causing problems with its health. We were extremely fortunate to hire Dr. Catherine Sobocinski as a lead author. She's an applied marine ecologist focusing on fishes, fish habitats, and impacts of human disturbance and climate change in coastal ecosystems. Western students are lucky enough to learn from her as she's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences and the new Marine and Coastal Science program. It's been a pleasure for me to work alongside her during the creation of this report, which is currently out for peer review. We hope to share it with you by early April. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Get my screen shared. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Can someone throw me a high sign that that's happening? Yes. Okay. Yep. Okay, thank you. So as Jenny said, I am an assistant professor here at Western Washington University in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Marine and Coastal Science. And this project actually predates my time here at Western. I'm coming to you today from the ancestral lands and waters of the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe here in the Salish Sea. But I've spent most of my life in estuaries around the country. So just a little bit of background before I begin. I grew up on the shores of Casco Bay in the great state of Maine and did my dissertation work in Chesapeake Bay on fish use of eelgrass beds there. But for most of my adult life, I've called the Salish Sea home, and I'm happy to be continuing my work here at Western. My expertise is in marine fish ecology, but I like to think of myself as a marine science generalist because I've worked across taxa. And my current projects involve jellyfish, herring, and salmon, among other things. So I do dabble in quite an array of things, and this report has actually really challenged me to dive into some aspects of Salish Sea marine science even further. So I wanted to start by showing this NASA International Space Station mission aerial photo or satellite photograph of, or space station photograph of the Salish Sea. I really like the aspect that's presented here. It's one we don't often think about, right? Maps are often with north up, and we're looking from the mountains kind of out towards the Pacific Ocean. And the Salish Sea is a biologically diverse inland sea that spans the international border, and it's surrounded by mountainous watersheds of spectacular beauty and features a rich cultural history as well. Since time immemorial, indigenous peoples have lived along the shores of the Salish Sea and among its surrounding rivers and forests. Today, the region is home to over 8 million people, and that number is growing. There are countless beautiful places and unique habitats within the Salish Sea estuary. There are river mouth deltas, high bluffs with beautiful madrona trees or arbutus to those in the north, and inlets and coves with both secluded and expansive views. We also have our fair share of charismatic fauna, from grumpy crabs to silly otters, and of course the salmon that have sustained the local people for thousands of years. But we are also an urbanized and urbanizing estuary with the sprawling metropolises of Vancouver and Seattle and other sizable cities like Victoria, Olympia, and Tacoma. And with all of this urbanization comes a number of different aspects of infrastructure that we've built to support our commerce and economic engines. And it's really come at the expense of natural habitats, and it's disrupted ecosystem functions in many senses. Here you can see a lot of the Seattle skyline as you make your way on Highway 99. This is an older picture, so a little bit different now. But a lot of this development occurred long ago. In the right-hand picture is Port Townsend, Washington. As I learned last week, it's known as Katai to the Jamestown Sklallam people. And it had its heyday in the 1880s. So much of this waterfront was developed over 150 years ago. Similarly, the railroad that runs along the east side of the Salish Sea from Olympia to north of Vancouver has been in place for over 100 years, disrupting shoreline processes and separating the uplands from the estuary and breaking some of that ecosystem connectivity that we think of between our beautiful mountains and forests into the nearshore marine waters. So much of what was transition habitat or an ecotone between the marine and estuarine waters and the upland has been lost. And this includes marshes and tidal deltas that's been filled for urban development or agriculture. And the city of Seattle is no exception, with much of what you're looking at in this picture also fill. All the while, we face a newer threat in global climate change. 2020 was one of the warmest years on record, tied with 2016, with much of the globe up to 2 degrees above the average and some areas exceeding 4 degrees above normal Celsius. And temperatures continue to climb, as depicted on the right here. So we're seeing an increasing rate of temperature increase in recent years, and the temperatures are warming worldwide with few exceptions. There are some areas, as you see from the blue tones in this picture, but by and large, most of the globe is warming in some areas in dramatic fashion. So this warming is having profound impacts on our oceans, with thermal expansion of water masses leading to greater volumes of water, which interact with our coastal infrastructure in ways that we did not anticipate when it was constructed. This is Jericho Pier, a picture taken from the Jericho Sailing Center Association in Vancouver. And global climate change is having local impacts in ways like this, where we're seeing floods of docks and piers and other infrastructure that we may need. So when we look out into the beauty of the Salish Sea, we miss what's beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. We know the ecosystem has seen profound change, but we've only recently started to think about this inland sea as a whole being. While much work has been done in Puget Sound and in the Strait of Georgia, less research has spanned the bioregion, considering the Salish Sea as a whole socio-ecological system. And it is a diverse system, which makes generalizations, both in human use and in ecosystem function, a great challenge. So that brings me to why we're here today, which is, what is the state of the Salish Sea? Our published literature and our reports are evidence of the compartmentalization of this system. So here we have the state of the Sound, the state of our watersheds, and 2 reports on state of physical, biological, and selected fishery resources in the Canadian marine ecosystems and the Strait of Georgia, as well as climate change in our natural resources from the treaty tribes associated with the Northwest Inuit Fisheries Commission. So this made us consider what the state of the Salish Sea really is when we think about this ecosystem, especially the estuarine portion of the ecosystem. So that's deriving a lot of the fresh water that's coming off of the land and also interacting with the Pacific Ocean. So there was a previous effort referred to as the Shared Waters Report that was done about 25 years ago. And this was the first time that we really considered this inland sea as one unit. Subsequently, we've now named it the Salish Sea, and this report documented active change and declining trends throughout the Salish Sea, and first brought attention to many of the issues that we still grapple with today. And other issues were made front and center in our scientific inquiry subsequent to this report. So in 25 years, a lot has happened. Our population has nearly doubled, and we've seen a lot more growth and development and urbanization to outlying areas from the major cities. So the purposes of the State of the Salish Sea report are to provide a credible assessment of the estuarine ecosystem structure and function in the Salish Sea, highlight two key and overarching threats to the ecosystem function, and these are population growth or urbanization and climate change, and identify the key ecosystem impacts from these. We also wanted to identify information gaps and emerging concerns because we know a lot of what's been happening in the past or continues to happen, but these emerging concerns are things that we might be able to get ahead of. And then also highlight the types of actions that can be taken for conservation and or changing the course towards restoration and recovery. So these were the objectives for the report when we set out. And just not an hour ago, I received a mock-up of the cover. So we're in sort of a design phase. We commissioned this beautiful photograph or purchased this photograph from Yuri Shafor, who's a photographer up on Vancouver Island. And we're working towards finalization of this product. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what the report will contain. So I gave you a brief introduction that sort of hit on all the high points. But we wanted to set the stage for the introduction to the Salish Sea. So what the setting, the cities, the people who are here, and also highlight the biophysical structures and processes. As you'll see in a second, the oceanography in the system is really unique. And I think explaining some of that helps to make some of the other impacts and various other aspects of the report. It gives it some context for that. So then we moved on to highlighting these two focal impacts that we chose for this effort. So anthropogenic changes to the seascape from urbanization, and the focus is really on the estuarine waters of the Salish Sea. I want to stress that the watershed is connected. We do see a lot of processes happening in the upland that link to what goes on in the estuarine waters of our inland sea. But really for the purposes of this report, we are focused on the seascape. So the estuarine seascape, kind of stretching from head of tide out to the shelf edge. And then the second impact is climate change. And we can think about these as sort of a locally driven impact and a globally driven impact. But the reality is that the results and the impacts of both of them are local. The report also has a section on cumulative effects. And I think this is one of the most important aspects to recognize in the Salish Sea, is that none of our impacts are happening in isolation. And then the report concludes with some needs and opportunities and suggestions for how we can start to move the needle in the direction of recovery and restoration. So to reorient you, I know over the last few weeks, Stefan gave a nice talk about maps in the Salish Sea and beyond. And we have a new map of the Salish Sea that Dr. Aquila Flower in the Environmental Studies Department here at Huxley College has made, and she is featuring in her Salish Sea Atlas that she's developing. And I think it's important to recognize that the US and Canada share this geomorphic history that's been heavily influenced by past geology, past ice ages. We have numerous freshwater inputs, including the Fraser River, which is the largest freshwater source in the Salish Sea. So that's coming in here. And we have a set of interconnected inland waterways that also are connected to the Pacific Ocean through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Johnstone Strait to the north. So Johnstone Strait is kind of up in this area, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca is here. So the vegetation communities of the uplands reflect highly variable local climate conditions, but there's this real connectivity between the upland mountainous regions of the Cascades and some of the mountains on the Olympics and Vancouver Island and the Pacific Ocean. But this connectivity between the ocean and the uplands really runs through the Salish Sea. And it is an inland sea that's tightly connected both to the ocean and to terrestrial processes and riverine processes. So with that in mind, we have a number of really important biogenic habitats. So habitats formed by biota or organisms beneath the surface here that are of much interest. So a lot of these habitats I'm featuring here provide ecosystem services to people in our region. So some of these biogenic habitats like kelp pictured here and seagrass, eelgrass pictured here are well-known features of our estuarine ecosystem. But others like the glass sponges featured in the middle picture are still being documented. These are common up in Howe Sound and other areas, or maybe not common, but exist up there. And they play an outsized role in carbon sequestration. Still other features in our region, like the Olympia oysters depicted on the bottom photo, are being renewed after periods of decline and overharvest. And we're putting some effort into renewing this local oyster species, this endemic species that we know is more resistant to climate change and some of its effects than some of the non-native species. So all of these biogenic habitats are critically important in maintaining ecosystem function, from biogeochemical cycling to habitat provisioning for fishes and invertebrates. And in the case of shellfish, they also make fine food for the people in this region. So if we go back to this photo and look down on the ecosystem, we can see the connectivity between the rivers and the ocean. And so I'm going to dive into a little bit of the physical processes in this area to illustrate these a little bit further. And it's important to note that it's sort of a funny shaped ecosystem, right? So we've got an inlet in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then we've got a large area heading south to South Puget Sound and Hood Canal. And then we've got this large area in the Strait of Georgia heading up to this really intricately islanded area in the north. So there's a lot of really interesting features to this system that make for some very interesting oceanography. But the system is very much influenced by both the freshwater runoff from the terrestrial system and from the ocean. So freshwater input is really a defining feature of the Salish Sea. Freshwater input is what makes the Salish Sea an estuary, right? It's the mixing of fresh and salt water. And what I want to point out with this figure, so this, I grabbed some data from the Washington Department of Ecology and just chose a couple of rivers at random. So a few Canadian rivers and a few American rivers, and wanted to plot the discharge over the course of a year from January to December of the various rivers. And what should pop out at you right away is this is the Fraser, and it's just an absolutely enormous amount of water being contributed to the system relative to all the other rivers. We think of the Skagit River in this part of the world as being quite a large river, but that's the green line. So it's quite a bit less in terms of annual discharge than the Fraser River. So this is really our primary source of freshwater contribution. And if we go back to this photo right here, it also happens to be sort of right at the nexus of where the Strait of Juan de Fuca and this major inlet outlet for the Salish Sea interacts with the river. So I want to talk a little bit about exchange flow. I am not a physical oceanographer, but I'm going to do my best to explain this because I think it's fundamental to understanding something about the Salish Sea and how the processes work to both alleviate some of our problems and maybe exacerbate some of them. So freshwater enters the system from the rivers and interacts with ocean water. Ocean water is denser than freshwater, so the freshwater tends to come in on the top and the ocean water comes in on the bottom. And then through tides and currents, we see this turbulent mixing in the middle that kind of mixes these two bits of water up and into maybe a third water mass. Let's think about it that way. So we have this turbulent mixing caused by tides. But what's important here is that the difference in density of the freshwater and the ocean water actually drives this sort of countercurrent exchange. As freshwater goes out, it's drawing through processes of physics the ocean water in, and then it circulates, it bifurcates and either heads north or south there. So it's important to know that the tides and currents help mix this water and send it on its way, but that really this fresh water is driving, by pushing out, it's drawing the ocean water into the system. And so most of our nutrients in the system, by and large, come from ocean water. This is nutrient-rich Pacific Ocean water that's upwelled off the coast and enters through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So we have a very complex ecosystem, and I should mention that that previous figure came from Parker McCready, who also has made this live ocean model that I'm going to show you now. So this model actually explains, this is a 3-day forecast model, and it's available. You can go out on the internet and find this on Parker's site. I've listed the URL at the top, but we can see how the water moves through the system with these different surface speeds and currents. And it's different in different areas depending upon islands or other features of the system. So I'm going to play this again, and I want you to pay attention to sort of the distal regions of the Salish Sea relative to what's going on in the strait. And what you can see here is that at certain tides, the mixing and the current up in the strait is really, really intense. And we see some other areas around the Tacoma Narrows and other places, but then there are other places where it's just not as strong. So this is a complex ecosystem with unique oceanography throughout the system that's driven by this series of sills and basins that produce the bathymetry within the system and drive a lot of the circulation that we see. So at this point, we have another model that was put together by Trian Kangawanka at PNNL. And this is showing the circulation of the sort of the prevailing currents in the system. And I'm not going to ask you to look at every little thing here because there are a number of different features that have been documented, but essentially we have a good idea of how the water is flowing through the system. So this is inflow on the left and outflow on the right, and how it's circulating throughout the system. So most of the water that exits the Salish Sea actually once entered it as salt water to begin with. So very little fresh water in overall is being exchanged relative to the volume of ocean water that's being exchanged. So this circulation results in high productivity. We see nutrient rich, this nitrogen rich water, that ocean water that comes in, it circulates throughout the Puget Sound and Strait of Georgia basins. And this movement of water also transports nutrients, sediments, and organic material. And as I just said, most of the water exiting the Strait of Juan de Fuca originally came from the Pacific Ocean in the first place, after circulating around at various rates, depending upon the season and where you are in the system. So the rate of circulation varies. So these nutrients that we get from the ocean fuel primary productivity. And in this system, productivity is thought to be moderate to high relative to other temperate estuarine ecosystems. And we have a number of primary producers like phytoplankton, but also benthic plankton, seagrasses, kelps, and other macroalgae that help fuel this very complex food web. And what is represented here is just a small fraction of the organisms in our ecosystem. I think we've got over 250 fish species alone that have been documented in this region, numerous mammals and birds, and so many plankton, we can't count them all. So this circulation that I was just talking about also serves to buffer some of our anthropogenic impacts. So as we've really worked out the circulation patterns in the open oceans, and we see that they're very predictable over timescales that we can model and deal with in an analytical set, we also can see this within the Salish Sea. So we're starting to see how circulation throughout the system and where water moves is helping us to understand some of our anthropogenic impacts. So seasonal disparities in circulation and thus residence time, how long the water masses are in a given place, mean that some problems like eutrophication can be exacerbated seasonally or in particular regions. But these problems may be mitigated when the season changes and the circulation pattern changes. So you might think of circulation throughout the system as preventing kind of a stagnant water mass. And in general, in our system, the water keeps moving. And this affords some degree of resilience to some of the problems that we face. So about those problems, we are 8 million strong and growing. I think we will be up to about 9 million by the end of this decade, and if rates continue. And even with our favorable oceanography, the fact remains we're a very populous region. So as I said at the top of the presentation, we focused on two primary impacts for this report: urbanization and the local impacts from population growth and the infrastructure and impacts to the seascape from that. And then also climate change, the local manifestations of a global problem to which we are all contributing. So I just wanted to point out, I took this NOAA GOES satellite image because it shows some of the connectivity between the Pacific Ocean and our region. So if you've spent any time around Western Washington or Western Canada this year, you know that we've been inundated with atmospheric rivers, and really, this is the greatest example that I can think of the connectivity between the Pacific Ocean and our region. So what is happening sort of in the global ocean really directly influences us. And that's just one meteorological example I can point to from that. So the infrastructure associated with development and urbanization is very visible to the human eye in terms of the footprint on the Salish Sea seascape. So I spoke of the railroad before, and you can see here this little inlet, which may have served as a borrow ditch for the actual, for the train track. is separated now from the greater bay that it's connected to. So we've got a number of marinas and various other parts of infrastructure. This is Victoria Harbor at night, and then also ferry docks and piers and various other things that are physical evidence that we can see of human impact on the seascape. But there's other evidence that we can't see as well. And we need to think of the Salish Sea as the receiving waters for all of the fresh water that comes in and all of the sort of human impacts that are associated with it. And this includes septic systems and wastewater treatment plants and all the runoff, stormwater runoff from urban centers, and how that impacts the various biota is important. So there's a complex contaminant, there's a group of complex contaminants that mix in the water as it enters the Salish Sea. And many organisms are experiencing sublethal effects of this contaminant exposure, with others experiencing lethal exposure. And this is a long-term, multi-generational problem, especially if you're a fish or an invertebrate that has a short life cycle. You are for years this has been going on. These are not new problems for the most part, although the suite of contaminants has changed over time. We continue to see this exposure through these pathways. And there are multiple stressors across this system. But we have taken action and we continue to take action. So we are educating people about stormwater. The municipalities are improving infrastructure. Here's the new Victoria treatment plant. And legacy impacts are being remedied by concerned community members and dedicated NGOs that are working to remove hazards like this derelict fishing gear from the Salish Sea. Many urbanization problems can be solved with an understanding of the root problem and the political will and concomitant funding to make change. So watershed protection, treatment of stormwater runoff, shoreline buffers, and other technological or regulatory actions can be implemented to move the needle toward lessening human impact from urbanization. What's a little more challenging is the global climate change aspect. So while weathering these continuing impacts from a growing human population, the Salish Sea is also facing the threat of global climate change. We have very active and productive groups in our region at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium associated with University of Victoria and at UW with the Climate Impacts Group that are taking the global climate models produced by the IPCC and applying them at regional levels to better understand the local impacts. So as these climate models are getting better and better, we're able to downscale them and make predictions about what we are or what we stand to have in store for us in this region. So I'd like to point out that the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission produced this really nice paper report a couple of years ago called Climate Change in Our Natural Resources. And I've drawn this rather busy diagram from that, but they made this conceptual model of all the ways that climate change was impacting treaty protected resources. But many of these are resources that we all stand to benefit from either an aesthetic value or other way. So in the green here are the ocean processes. So climate change impacts include ocean acidification, warming, harmful algal blooms, lower dissolved oxygen, deoxygenation in general, sea level rise, and various other things. So I encourage you, if you're interested in these things, there's a really nice report along with the State of Knowledge report that the Climate Impacts Group put out. These are two good accessible readings about climate change in our region. And in many respects, we're able to model the physical processes or understand the physical processes fairly well using these downscaled climate models and hydrodynamic models with the climate model inputs. So here we've got two different models, stream temperatures on the left and sea surface temperature on the right, taken from two different sources here, but we can give some prediction into the future. This is 2040s and 2080s about what our stream temperature will be based upon these global climate models. So these are model outputs, but events like the marine heat wave we had a few years ago, known as the blob, serve as nice natural experiments to provide observations of increased temperature that we can use as inputs in our local models and to validate model predictions in the near term. So this, the model on the right is a sea surface temperature model, which focuses on the Snohomish estuary. And you can see that there's quite a bit of temperature increase anticipated and less so with salinity. So one of the biggest impacts of global climate change locally is that the water temperature is increasing. So projections based on trends suggest that the mean water temperature could be 1.5 to 3 degrees C warmer by the end of the 21st century. And in combination with other things, this could result in some years with average temperatures as much as 5 degrees C above the 20th century climatology, so the reference point. Here we've got the Canada Lighthouse data. There's a lighthouse data set from Canada where they've measured temperature and salinity for over 100 years. This really serves as a really nice long-term data set looking at water temperature. And all of these lighthouses are have water temperatures above sort of the average anomaly. So they're even above warmer than an average anomaly. It's important to note that this paper by Olivier Riche was published in 2014. So this was prior to the blob. And what they published in this paper, that the temperatures would be 1.5 to 3 degrees C warmer, compounded by PDO, El Nino, other things like the marine heat wave or a marine heat wave could be as much as 5 degrees C. So if we just look at the effects of the marine heat wave, this is a heat map of the temperatures experienced during the blob from this paper. You'll see that in areas we are well above 1 degree. So there's some 2s and 3s in here in our region, and the Pacific Ocean at large was quite a bit warmer. So that was a very good, the next year, the predictions there were borne out by the compounding of the temperature rise just based upon global climate change, and then these heat wave events that could make matters worse on a smaller, shorter scale. Another impact is that the sea is rising, right? So we know as I mentioned before, as the thermal expansion of the water happens, we're getting inundation into low-lying areas, changing the shallow intertidal zone and some of our few remaining wetlands that we have. A lot of our coastal wetlands have been developed and are no longer existing as wetlands, and instead they've been replaced by infrastructure that's important to our transportation systems and other development. I'd like to point out that related to sea level rise, tribes and First Nations are really doing some of the leading work to document these impacts and develop climate adaptation plans in response. And I think that there have been great strides taken by many tribes in this region and First Nations to produce these reports and really document the effects of this sea level rise on low-lying areas. But cities and other municipalities are also having to respond to this. So I grabbed this Vancouver sea level rise story map from the city of Vancouver, where they're asking the community to go out on king tides or very large tidal events and take pictures of some of these low-lying areas where they're expecting inundation to interact with existing infrastructure. Of course, when we build bridges and various other structures, they're typically thought to have 75 to 150 year lifespans. And over that time, we've already seen a lot of sea level rise in some areas. So while the physical aspects of climate change are pretty well known for this region, documenting biotic response is a little bit more challenging. So we know that acidification and deoxygenation are anomalously high in this region due to coastal oceanography. And we also know that water temperatures and sea levels are rising. But due to the complex oceanography in this region and the large size of our system, conclusive studies about biological response are still in the works, although there's a growing body of evidence. And here, this paper that was published in 2014, so quite a while ago by Oki et al., has a nice cataloging with references of all several different biotic impacts of climate change, all the way from phytoplankton through the top predators, including birds, fishes, and mammals. So there are many efforts looking at this. And in fact, from these seminars just this year, we heard about the role of warming temperature in eelgrass wasting disease. And then last year, we heard about the role of ocean acidification for calcifying organisms throughout the ecosystem with many nice references. So these are two very tangible examples of ways that climate change are impacting biota in our region. So we must consider that the non-climate anthropogenic stressors, so those from urbanization, also affect the capacity of the biota to adapt to climate change. This is a big thing, right? So we have multiple competing, potentially synergistic effects that are happening at the same time. The altered ecosystem is impacted by continuing urbanization and climate change. So there were already existing impacts, and these things are still going on, and maybe even new impacts are happening. We often depict these cumulative impacts with cartoons because in reality, they're very difficult to study. But we have made strides in some areas, like observing and documenting the cumulative impacts of shoreline armoring. And that's depicted on the right here. So we know that there are some temporal or there are some detectable impacts of shoreline armoring on these different scales. And this was a nice paper that wrapped up a long-standing body of work that I actually was originally involved with in the early 2000s. And it was really great to see this come to a head. And actually, this documentation of these cumulative impacts allows for a little bit more translation of science to policy. So our permitting processes are often piecemeal, parcel by parcel is how we're permitting shoreline armoring, but having evidence of large-scale cumulative impacts provides some rationale to take large-scale policy action for this problem to prevent further degradation. So these cumulative impacts are really, really important to document and to understand, because I think it leads to a greater awareness of the interaction of all these varying problems. But observing and understanding complex effects is very challenging, but it's also very difficult. It's also very important to translating science to policy. So I've been involved a little bit with salmon work the last few years, understanding marine survival of salmon in the Salish Sea. And this really got me thinking about salmon as ecosystem integrators, because they're taking advantage of all the different habitats, including the inland waters of the Salish Sea, where survival rates have been documented in these 3 papers that I've shown here to be lower than in some of the other areas. So as they move from the river out to the Pacific Ocean, they have to reside in the Salish Sea. And there are numerous potential causes for why the survival might be lower in this region. And we're starting to get a handle on some of the leading causes of that work. But salmon really are integrating across our ecosystem and connecting the ocean to the rivers. So the pressures on the Salish Sea are relentless and growing. The Salish Sea is influenced by terrestrial and marine processes. The circulation patterns change seasonally and are predicted to change with climate change. So that's another big important aspect about circulation and why it's important. So we know that it helps buffer or mitigate some of the risks that we're seeing from things like eutrophication and low dissolved oxygen. But as the climate changes, our circulation patterns will also change. That's understood for the global ocean, and our region is no different. As river input changes, we will see a difference in exchange flow with season and potentially volume of river water. So this system is very hard to generalize. I said that at the top, both in terms of ecology and human impacts and sort of human use and understanding of the system. It's a broad ecosystem that ranges from really remote, what we might think of as pristine areas, to highly urbanized areas. So making generalizations about the problems and the solutions is very hard. And actually making generalizations about the science is also very hard. We have these legacy, continuing, and emerging impacts that interact to create the state that we observe today and that we are making predictions about for the future. So we've also got this time scale. So we've got both space and time that we need to tackle. This is not a unique problem to our ecosystem, but I think some of the oceanography does make it a challenge to try and understand very intricate and ever-changing physical processes in the system that then drive some of the biological response. So in conclusion, I will say that some of the lessons that came from working on this report is that science is critically important for understanding fundamental processes and problems. And I think that the shoreline armoring example is a great one, because we really needed to understand what the impacts were on a local scale before we could scale that up and try and turn it into some policy recommendations for how we should change how we do shoreline development. So communication is also key for bringing awareness to problems. I've grabbed some pictures from the last Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference that the Salish Sea Institute organized. And I think this is a really great way for scientists and educators and policymakers to all get together and keep active and engaged about what's going on in our system. Lastly, our leadership in this region must be bold to maintain and restore this ecosystem given the cumulative change that we have observed. So I'd like to thank a number of people. We have an advisory committee for the report, which really helped with report scoping. And then a number of informal advisors contributed to this work along the way, a lot of informal conversations with a number of people. So they're listed here. As Ginny mentioned during the introduction, the report is currently out for peer review, and I owe a debt of gratitude to those who have been willing to take this on as a peer review project, because it is a rather substantial effort. It's hands down the hardest thing I've worked on in my life, and much harder than my dissertation. And it also is going to take some doing for someone to read it with a critical eye. So I'm grateful for the contribution that those people are making as well. Lastly, I'd like to say thank you to a number of contributors. So the way the report was set up is I'm the primary author, but we contributed these discrete sort of technical pieces from technical experts in different areas of biota or whatever it is within the Salish Sea. And a number of people contributed to this effort by producing something, sort of a short form piece on a topic of interest that fit in with the report. And these really add a lot more variety and different voices to the report. So I'm very grateful for people being willing to contribute in this way. I think it will make for a more interesting product. So with that, I thank you for attending the Huxley seminar today. I really appreciate everyone's interest in this, and I can't wait to share the report with you as well. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you. That's fantastic. What a lot of information, and what a piece of work. Bunch of questions coming in. A couple of quick ones. One is, what is rack accumulation? Rack with a W.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
What is rack accumulation? One of your slides.
Rack accumulation. Yeah, that was on the shoreline armoring slide, I guess. So rack is all the detritus, like typically it's algae or eelgrass that washes up on the shoreline. So if you're walking along the beach at high tide, you will see, or at low tide when the tide's out, you'll see there's sort of deposits of this material. And you might just think of it as funk that's lining the shoreline, but it actually serves a good ecological purpose. So there are a number of organisms that make their living in there, and such as amphipods and a bunch of insects and things. And those are then consumed by lots of birds and small mammals that live along shorelines. So it's actually kind of an important aspect to intertidal or nearshore ecology, where marine derived organic matter is being put up on the shore and then being used by a number of invertebrates and other organisms as habitat, and turning the nutrients from that into some sort of subsidy to the terrestrial land.
Great, yeah. And there was a couple of questions about there's the number of roughly 8 million and growing people. In terms of, is that, what is that, Washington State? Is that both sides of the border? Is that the watershed? And then my follow-up is, if it's the watershed, what do you define as the watershed?
Yeah, so this is a really challenging question, and one that Aquila Flower and I have talked about a lot, because we don't really have great census data at the moment. So we're using that number as Salish Sea wide, and it's essentially the counties that border the Salish Sea in the US, and then some, I'm not as familiar with the Canadian data, so I can't tell you at what level. I know that it's a finer resolution than what we have on the US side. So we've used a combination of census data from Canada, which actually I believe is also collected more frequently, and what we have here. It's not a precise number, so that's why we're a little hand wavy, but there are some projections from various economic councils and stuff about rates of growth and that kind of thing. So,
and that's basically in the basin, not that there's a lot of people in the upper Fraser River watershed, but
no, I would say in the basin, yes.
So then there's a number of questions. 5 degrees centigrade, that sounds like potential fish extinction was the question. So does the report, or are there people looking into, what does that mean if we have 3 to 5 degrees?
Yeah, I think there is a section in the report about this. So sort of vulnerability, species vulnerability to climate change. This is a big topic of research around the world. In fact, just earlier today, my husband was giving a presentation on this very thing to groups. So it's a big area of research. And one thing, so there are a couple things. There's sensitivity, and then there's exposure and adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity is the one I'll tackle, because that really gives us an idea of what the organism's ability is to either withstand those higher temperatures, to move, or not thrive. One of the things that's interesting about the Salish Sea is we're sort of in the middle of the greater California current marine ecosystem. So we are not at the extreme ends of many species distributions. So most of the species that we have in the Salish Sea are also found in the California current. There are exceptions, but especially with fishes, there's a wide variety of marine fish that are found across the sort of the large marine ecosystem that we are nestled within. So there's also a lot of work that's shown that as temperatures warm, fishes will start to shift their distributions to the poles. So we might expect that some of these species will move further north. So cod and hake, pollock are some that we used to see more readily in the Salish Sea that have already sort of started to disappear and aren't as prevalent. So there will be shifting distributions for sure. But whether that means they're extirpated, I don't know.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions on toxic, contaminations to the area. Does the study go into specific toxins, either
Yep,
location or chemical wise?
Yeah, we have a whole section on contaminants. By the virtue of the length of the talk, I couldn't dive into everything, but there is a section on contaminants, especially we highlight sort of contaminants of emerging concern, because that's one of the emerging issues. Of course, these new suites of contaminants, we've stopped inputs of PCBs and some of the legacy pollutants, but of course, there are a number of things that are still being input to the system that may have impacts.
Yeah, of course. So are there places in the Salish Sea that are doing particularly well or poorly in whatever metric you choose to look at? And specifically Bellingham Bay, people have asked about.
So I have to be honest, I haven't really dove into Bellingham Bay all that much, although I know water quality has improved in recent years. And so that might be a function of different circulation or inputs of what was once coming in is now no longer coming in to make it in as bad of state as it once was. There are certainly winners and losers, sort of with climate change too, there are winners and losers. I think that's another important aspect is some things will benefit from increasing temperatures, for example, and some things will be able to withstand changing climate, different aspects of climate change better than others. So there are areas that are doing better. I mean, it's sort of what is the metric that you're asking? So this was a big challenge at the outset of this report. We tossed around the term ecosystem health, which people really like to use, but it's very poorly defined in most cases. So thinking about the system in terms of like ecosystem structures, so those biogenic habitats and various physical processes that are happening, and then the functions that go along with it is a little bit easier in terms of a sort of ecosystem science perspective, because you actually are putting your finger on real tangible and measurable qualities.
Yeah. So then a number of questions. I'm going to try to lump 3 or 4 together. In terms of where does the report go? Does it go to legislatures on either side of the border? And are there specific recommendations at a more personal level included? And where do people find the report when it's all done?
Yeah, so the great questions. The report will be published through the Salish Sea Institute, and we're actually working with Western libraries to figure out the best way to do that and to disseminate that at the moment. So it will be widely available and freely available. And we hope that it gets wide readership. That's the hope in writing something of this magnitude, is that we can get it out there and get people reading about some of these topics that they might not know as much about. So that certainly is the hope. And there will be a number of events as we get closer to completion to try, sort of seminars like this aimed at trying to get the word out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on salmon farming feasible? Is it sustainable? How is it going to work? in Salish Sea?
I think that's also very context dependent. It seems to arise in every one of these seminars, so I'll punt on that one.
And another is the talk get into the phenology in the report at all?
Yeah, there's a little bit about phenology. Certainly, that's a big concern if we start thinking about timing of spring bloom. So the spring phytoplankton, the onset of the spring phytoplankton bloom is really important for driving the entire ecosystem. So as the that shifts earlier or later and doesn't coincide with upwelling or freshwater, some of the physical processes that could have major disruptions to the system. So there is some about that in the report. Yeah. The report, just to give some a better context maybe, or something that people can relate to, the report's going to be about 200 pages of Word documents. So I think it's up to about 50,000 words at this point, I realized. So it's pretty complex and very well referenced. So if there's something you're interested in that, is not in the report itself, it's typically got a reference to where you could go for that.
And is there a plan for another one? When's the next one going to be?
No comment.
The next time we get $300,000 given to the Institute.
There you go. Excellent. And so I want to end on the question that says, when the report comes out, what will the headline in the Seattle Times read?
That's a good one. I think that the pressures are relentless and growing, and that we need to do something about it. I do not write the headlines for the Seattle Times, and mine would be way boring, and no one would ever click on it. It would not generate the revenue that the Seattle Times wants. So again, I may not, but I think that that's the take home for me in doing this, was that this is like a very 30,000 foot level, looking down at sort of all of the problems, where I am typically, as a research scientist, like diving into very, minute aspects of something and creating statistical models that are like really, really nitpicky. But taking this 30,000 foot view really has given me a different perspective. And I think the cumulative effects are really important to discern and to take some action on.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to it. Thank you for all that work. Again, thank you, Catherine. And a plug: next week, we'll have Darcy Matthews from U Victoria, who's a ethnoecologist and an anthropologist, talking about his work over on the other side of the border. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you, Catherine.
Great job,
Thank you.
Catherine.